This is a Dancing Stickman production. Hello, and welcome to Worldsbuilder, Episode 2. This episode is actually just a post-mortem, me by myself, interviewing myself, of a project I ran over the summer on Blue Sky called Broken Sky. So we're just going to jump right into it. Worldsbuilder is a podcast about the business of creativity, and I dropped myself headfirst into running an online alternate reality game right at the time that I published the first episodes of Oops All Witches in March 2025, which is a perfect case study if I'm going to talk about how to successfully run creative projects. Broken Sky was a transmedia online ARG, cross-promoting Oops All Witches and The Witches of Wadera Keep by Jacob Wolf-Lefton. We spent about 3 months prepping, and we ran the game on Blue Sky in July. We worked with Maisie Veselak, the game designer of Wickedness, which is the game Jacob ran, and the designer of the Witch class from Worlds Beyond Number that I ran. We also worked with Jay Dragon and Possum Creek Games, Maisie's publisher, and over 24 people in the indie TTRPG and actual play space. We developed what I thought was a pretty fun story where Tyos, the god of order and sovereignty from Oops All Witches, broke through and possessed Jacob, while the nameless thing that invented death, the antagonist from Wadera Keep, possessed me. And it was up to the TTRPG community to find our lore keeper game designer allies to find the spells that would break the curse. We recorded scenes, built puzzles, designed and published original mini TTRPGs, and live roleplayed on Blue Sky. Now, none of this is to say that the game's reception was a success. We had maybe 40 or 50 people follow the accounts that were involved, and very few of them actually engaged with the game. But the point of a postmortem is to figure out the lessons learned so that the next project has a higher chance of success. It's been about 6 weeks since Broken Sky wrapped, and I have been sitting with the experience. Also, September is the first month of this year that I've worked enough to make rent, so I have naturally turned inward to handle my personal business, and I've pivoted to working on projects that I can do locally and in person. Producing and running a game remotely in 8 time zones for 4 months took a lot out of me, and it affected me enough that at my request, my biggest client is training me to work at their live events instead of only editing for them because I would like to physically work around people. I'm ready to poke my head out on the internet again, at least a little. I'm not going to lie, the outcome of Broken Sky was disappointing, and I've been quietly and solitarily processing my resentment, because resentment is a poison that has to be processed. Besides, I knew the whole time that a disappointing outcome was maybe the likeliest outcome. I was making a game of a type that people aren't familiar with for a community I'm not part of. I have big aspirations for building new media that lets the audience be a part of telling the story, so I'm not exactly surprised that my first attempt didn't land. So, this is a postmortem. Let's start with lessons learned from a practical and logistical basis. Before we start, I am not going to say that the scale of this game was too big. We had over 30 people in the Dancing Stickman server, and everyone was prepped and rehearsed for the original plan. The failures in this game were not of scope and scale, but of my organizational management of the project. First, from an operational standpoint, Blue Sky is not a good platform for a project like this. Because of the lack of an algorithm, it would have required nearly constant posting to get the game posts up in front of the audience at the level we'd have needed for sustained engagement. Neither my nor Jacob's Wadera Keep accounts had the follower numbers to expose the game to enough people to get them playing, and I wasn't comfortable asking for constant posting from the people who joined us who had larger audiences. Not only that, but I didn't get to playtest the game until we were playing it. So I only conceptualized the diffuse nature of how the posting would read on Blue Sky, but I didn't get to see exactly how diffuse it was until we were in the game. Too diffuse for people to understand what was going on, it turned out. Second, the marketing for this game was trash. To be fair to myself, I have received conflicting guidance on how to market alternate reality games. The people I know with extensive experience in building and running ARGs assured me that the games that get the most traction are the ones that people feel like they find organically, like discovering a secret. However, this was not a traditional ARG. It was aimed at a very particular audience. It was a blend with literary role-playing and online LARPing, and We built in a gameplay vernacular to distinguish when the people who were participating were in-game or not. There were conflicting opinions on how to get more people to notice and play, and by the time we were in gameplay and things weren't going to plan, it became a throw spaghetti at the wall situation. There were also some miscommunications and a variety of single points of failure in broadcasting that the game was happening. Related to this point, it was probably a mistake to make this game for a very small and particular audience. I did not realize that people who like playing TTRPGs don't necessarily like to solve puzzles. My thought was that games are games. Jacob built an amazing, sprawling choose-your-own-adventure. The puzzle on their profile could be solved simply by exploring the whole thing and finding a website and a password. I planted a game designer friend to expose the website so that the players only had to find the password, but no one chose to go that deep. I had our co-director, Ash, play through the puzzle on my profile just to be sure that I hadn't built something that was impossible to solve. Both Ash and my game designer friend assured me that this was well-built game design. Looking at the engagement metrics on my website and the way that people said that they were giving up after hitting dead ends in the Choose Your Own Adventure, it became clear that people just didn't want to solve them. That means that the audience needed to be bigger. But there were what I would term social restrictions to audience expansion that gave me pause. In the first week that the game was running, I was planting trailheads on various subreddits to try to get more engagement. I got to r/gaming, which has 3.4 million users, by far the largest subreddit of any that I'd posted on. But I chose not to post there. Because while I was sure that people who are more familiar with video games would have no problem with the puzzles, I didn't know who I'd be inviting into this indie TTRPG space on Blue Sky, and I do know that video game culture can be deeply toxic. But what that means is that Broken Sky's game design was fundamentally mismatched with the audience it was built for. Third, from a personal standpoint, my aversion to social media and online performativity absolutely kneecapped the project. In my professional life, I've made thousands of social media posts for various brands, directed by people with lackluster strategy to only mixed success. It is thankless, mind-numbing work that I've dubbed vomiting into the content hole. As a result, I've developed some pretty frank opinions about online audiences and the type of spoon-feeding they demand. As much as I would love for individuals and audiences to start thinking critically about the way they engage with content as part of a crowd, Broken Sky was not built to facilitate that. Although I will circle back to individual versus group dynamics later. But my own inbound attitude towards social media and what it takes to be successful on an online platform meant there was always going to be a ceiling on how far the game could go. If I'm staying on the personal track, my inbound attitude towards the TTRPG space kneecapped the project too. Let's be real about what this space is and how it started. TTRPGs are a small niche of the tabletop game space, and that is a small niche of the game space, which is just dominated by video games. And the TTRPG space is dominated by Dungeons & Dragons, a game created by a white man with seriously problematic views on anyone who isn't also a white man. My lifelong personal experience with the TTRPG space is that it's exclusionary and gatekept, and Broken Sky did not significantly alter that point of view. Maybe I just had the experience I came in expecting to have. It was my hope that working with marginalized folks in the indie scene would be more open, but I actually received a lot of feedback and confirmation that it's still very much a scene with customs to conform to. For instance, I ran face first into the space's hierarchy. I was told that the TTRPG space shouldn't be referred to as a community for what I can only call political reasons, or that if I used a single instance of generative AI to demonstrate that it was bad and against the game's rules, I would get everyone involved in the game blacklisted. After a certain point, I was actively self-censoring. I'm not a person who is okay with making myself smaller to fit in, but I did it anyhow for this project, and that's where the resentment that I've been processing stemmed from. Both the self-censorship and the resentment meant I was holding myself back and apart to keep things running smoothly. To be honest, I keyed in on this dynamic early, and I attempted to back out of the project before we were too committed for that to be an option for me anymore. Jacob asked me to stay, and I agreed. But I still can't say whether I think that was the right choice on my part. I am still beat. I'm out a lot of money because I paid the people that I could for their labor. And it feels like I made no inroads into the space. I am in the same position now in September that I was in February, if not a little worse off. I am a proactive person, but being the active doer and initiator all the time is exhausting. I emptied out my entire cup for this project, and I am on my own replenishing it. This is not to say that I blame anyone. It was my choice to continue on with the project even when my intuition told me not to. I already know what happens when I take on too much labor in a project. And I burned out, which I anticipated, when the game launched and no one picked it up, because that compounded the choice I'd made to carry most of the project on my back just to see that it got done. What I had found exciting about it in the beginning was the opportunity for cross-collaboration and to spotlight a multitude of different people and their work. But collaboration cannot be carried on enthusiasm alone. And that leads me to not only the personal lessons learned, but the feedback I think y'all who are creative workers should hear. As the project lead, I spent all my energy flexing around everyone else's availability. Game design, by contrast, was simple. I never had a single regularly scheduled meeting, and I wound up taking on work that I was clear and upfront was not in my capacity because other people committed to it but couldn't follow through. The administrative functionality of the project was built entirely around me personally and alone, making it easier for everyone else to participate. I'm not surprised that it didn't go very far. I'm not a strong enough engine for that. Now, before I get too far into it, I do want to explain where this is coming from. This is not something that I made to call out anyone in particular. This is a personal philosophy of mine that I have been practicing for my entire professional life, and I'll give you an example. When I was in my late 20s, before I moved to California, I was managing a retail sales store in Chicago. There were 5 people on the management team citywide, and 2 of them said things to me about one particular employee that were deeply racist. And when I left, I decided to toss a bomb behind me, and I reported to the corporate office that there was a problem with racial bias in the management of the team in Chicago. They asked me to name names, and I refused. Because to me, it's not really about any single person's actions or behavior. It's about a culture. And I have not only encountered what I'm about to describe in this space alone. There's a cultural issue. And if the people I worked with are listening to this, I am not calling out any single person. It's up to you to decide if what I am saying is applicable to you or not, or if you want to take anything from this. I'm certainly not seeking pity or apologies. I'm just trying to tell you what my experience was trying to work within this space and within this culture. The sentiment that I kept encountering from multiple directions was that I needed to understand that everyone else had the rest of their lives going on. Now, I never understood that sentiment because it never seemed to be applied to me, and because I accommodated everyone. That just wasn't acknowledged. The other thing I needed to understand was that anything else going on in folks' real lives was more important than the project. But frankly, if that's the case, they shouldn't have been participating. I was not done any favors just by the presence of people who weren't able to do the work. In reality, that was harmful to me and the project. And this is where we get into individual versus group dynamics. If it had been only one person engaging this way, that would have been manageable. But when a group expects that each person's individual needs have to be accommodated within the project for them to participate, that creates a toxic environment. I wouldn't voluntarily repeat the experience. In the last 6 weeks, I pivoted back to working in film, which is where my professional roots are, and it has been remarkably different. People in film also contribute their labor on spec and have other things going on in their lives, but they also say no when their other commitments preclude their participation, which allows me to move on and re-strategize or find something else. I was recently speaking with a filmmaker who used to work at EA, who said he encountered the same issues with indie game devs. He described it as a lack of discipline. They'd show up at the beginning all enthusiasm, but peter out when it came to follow through and finalization, which I do recognize as such. I have worked in a high volume, fast turnaround media publishing environment. I know how to work at scale. I know how to get things through a production process. My former coworkers in that space have referred to it as boot camp. And I did learn how to work in an organized, disciplined way. I even got comments about it from people I was working with on this project, that it was more organized than anything else they'd done. I think a lot of people don't realize that to get things done at scale, it stops being fun and it starts being an assembly line that has to be pushed through. There are a lot of reasons why folks don't get access to the kinds of spaces where discipline is learned, including historical oppression and marginalization, and the kind of shitty personal circumstances that arise from those things, as well as just shitty circumstances in general. But the reasons also include a lack of willingness to learn discipline, because discipline's hard, and it's demanding, and it's uncomfortable. Maurice Mitchell, the national director of the Working Families Party, wrote an excellent article about building resilient organizations that has points that I think are salient to projects like Broken Sky. In particular, he calls out the demand for what he terms unanchored care, or the assumption that one's mental, physical, or spiritual health is the responsibility of the collective space. I'll quote him here. Determining what is yours to hold versus what is the collective's is an essential life skill and fundamental to organizational work, collaboration, and meaningful engagement with others. This is also true for non-professional spaces. Emotional intelligence is a capacity an organization can and should embody, but no organization can take on the emotional labor that is squarely in the domain of the individual. This distinction is critical. Additionally, discomfort is part of the human condition and a prerequisite for learning. Violence and depression are to be avoided, but not discomfort. My failure as the project lead for Broken Sky was that I was trying to make everyone comfortable, and that I wasn't demanding or instituting discipline. This is how I was engaging in unanchored care. There was too much overlap in me trying to be friendly and in trying to get a project done. Because I was approaching the project and everyone involved as an outsider to the TTRPG space, I was contorting myself to fit in. But the project was my vision and my space. When I diminished myself, I diminished Broken Sky and the likelihood of its success. I can't honestly say whether I think it would have been better to follow my intuition and walk away early versus what I did do, abandon myself to get it done. It seems like a wash, and none of it matters now anyway. While I am grateful to everyone who participated for helping to build what we did manage to get published, there's a lot of cool shit that never got the chance to get off the ground. There are unsolved puzzles sitting in my drafts folder because no one solved the first set of puzzles. There was an AP performer whose puzzle would have been for players to join her in making our own original tarot deck, but we never even got to her. There was an entire witch hunter scenario that we never got to play through. Jacob and I co-GM'd scenes with pairs of RPCs, playing both Wickedness and D&D. I'll be publishing those scenes later in the year, but they were clues to puzzles that we built but never got to present. The biggest lesson that I've exited the project having learned is that I may want to create more opportunities for new kinds of collaborative storytelling that involves the audience in the story, but people aren't necessarily ready for that. I'll do what I can to lay the groundwork, but it won't be by creating projects that have so many single points of failure. I have to create projects that have built-in redundancies. In the meantime, I have to focus on my vision of success for myself versus creating projects that are meant to spotlight other people. Just because I'm doing that and just because other people like to be spotlighted doesn't mean that they can support me in doing the work to get it done. And I cannot do it all, or even most of it, by myself. I'll only be in the position to do that when I've built up enough personal resources and capacity to support that kind of work, and I'm not there yet. There are lots of little takeaways, right? match the project design to the audience or vice versa, which requires better marketing and better market research than I was able to do in such a short span with so few resources. Know that if you're doing something new, it might not land. Something that I know is that the best perspective on failures is that they're learning opportunities, and that most people who are considered successful have hundreds of failures behind them. But the most important and difficult lessons behind those takeaways is the emotional core. Moving on from failure requires resilience that can be hard come by. My therapist said she was impressed that even though I had a disappointing experience, I immediately picked myself up and moved on to the next projects. What I told her is that it's easier to do that than to be depressed. I didn't learn that in a professional space. I learned it from personal experience. And the work will always be difficult, but you have to be discerning when choosing your difficulties. So above everything, trust yourself and your own intuition. You know what works for you and what doesn't, and you are the only person who will always have your own back. So hold your boundaries. All that is the shit that takes years of inner work to develop. I'm 40 and have only applied those lessons imperfectly because I'm still learning. So that's the tea. That's what I've come out of Broken Sky having learned. I'll always be a little sad that it couldn't live up to its full potential, but I also know that I brought something new and innovative into a world that's just not ready for it yet. And FYI, you can visit www.brokensky.blue to see the puzzles and the amazing minigames created by our lore keepers. I have to thank Maisie Veselak, Jay Dragon, Ashlyn Sparrow, Annette Modan Lee, our writers, lore keepers, and plants, my PCs, Jacob's PCs, and of course, Jacob himself, for the incredible work they put into Broken Sky. I'll be publishing the sound design scenes that Jacob and I ran for each other, as well as the scenes we co-GM'd with our PCs in December, after Oops All Witches finishes publishing, and that will pick back up on October 3rd. After that, who knows? This has been episode 2 of Worldsbuilder. Thanks for listening.